The room went silent the moment the challenge was spoken. A seasoned karate master, confident, proud, and surrounded by his students, stepped forward and looked straight at Bruce Lee with a smirk that said everything without a word. "You think you understand real karate?" he asked, his voice sharp, almost mocking. The crowd leaned in, sensing something big was about to unfold. But Bruce Lee didn't react the way anyone expected. No anger, no ego, just a calm, unreadable expression, like he already knew how this would end. The tension in the air grew heavier with every passing second. You could feel it, that moment before something unbelievable happens. What the karate master didn't realize was that he wasn't just questioning a man. He was stepping into a completely different philosophy of fighting, one that doesn't follow rules, one that adapts, flows, and strikes before you even understand what's happening. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. The atmosphere inside the training hall was already charged, but the moment the karate master stepped forward, it shifted into something far more intense. Conversations faded into whispers, and even the smallest movement seemed to echo louder than they should. Students who had been practicing moments ago slowly gathered around, forming a loose circle, their curiosity pulling them closer. They all knew their master, his reputation, his discipline, his unwavering belief in traditional karate. He wasn't just skilled, he was respected, even feared in some circles for his precision and strict adherence to form. He stood tall, his posture rigid, every inch of his presence radiating authority. Years of training had shaped not just his body but his mindset. To him, martial arts wasn't just about fighting, it was about order, structure, and tradition. Every stance had a purpose, every strike followed a rule, and every movement was rooted in centuries of discipline. This was the foundation he had built his identity upon, and he carried it with pride. Across the room stood Bruce Lee, noticeably different in demeanor. Where the karate master was firm and grounded, Bruce seemed fluid, almost relaxed in a way. That didn't fit the tension of the moment. He wasn't trying to dominate the space, yet somehow he commanded attention just by being there. His eyes were calm, observant, quietly taking in everything around him without giving anything away. The karate master studied him carefully, his gaze sharp and slightly skeptical. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The speed, the unconventional methods, the philosophy that seemed to break away from tradition. To many, Bruce Lee was a rising legend. But to the master, those same qualities raised questions. How could someone who didn't strictly follow the established forms truly understand the depth of martial arts? That doubt slowly turned into something else, an urge to test, to challenge, to prove a point. He took a step forward, his movement deliberate, controlled. The sound of his foot against the wooden floor cut through the silence, drawing every eye toward him. His students straightened, sensing what was about to happen. They had seen this look before, the moment when their master decided to demonstrate authority, to remind everyone why his teachings were superior. "You," he said, his voice calm but edged with unmistakable confidence. It wasn't loud, yet it carried across the room with ease. "I've heard a lot about you." There was a slight pause, just enough to let the weight of his words settle. "They say you're fast. They say you're different." Another step forward, closing the distance just a little more. But speed alone doesn't define mastery. A few students exchanged glances, sensing the underlying tension. This wasn't just a conversation, it was the beginning of something more. The master's tone wasn't openly hostile, but there was a clear challenge hidden within his words, a subtle questioning of everything Bruce Lee represented. He continued, his voice gaining a sharper edge. "You move without form. You fight without structure. Tell me, how can that be considered true martial arts?" The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't asked out of curiosity, it was a test, almost an accusation. The master believed deeply in the discipline of karate, in the idea that true skill came from repetition, from mastering forms passed down through generations. To him, anything outside of that system felt incomplete, even reckless. Bruce Lee remained still, his expression unchanged. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't even shift his stance noticeably. It was as if he was letting the moment unfold naturally, allowing the master to reveal his thoughts completely. The silence that followed only seemed to fuel the master's confidence. He interpreted it as hesitation, perhaps even uncertainty. In his mind, this was already tilting in his favor. "You see," the master went on, gesturing slightly with his hand as if addressing not just Bruce, but everyone watching. "Karate is not just about fighting, it is about discipline, control, and respect for tradition. Without these, what you have is not mastery. It is chaos." A murmur rippled through the students. They nodded subtly, agreeing with their teacher. This was what they had been taught from the beginning. Structure was everything. Without it, there was no foundation. The master's eyes locked onto Bruce Lee again, more intense now. "So, I ask you, do you truly believe you understand karate?" The question landed like a direct strike. It wasn't just about technique. It was about identity, about philosophy, about challenging the very core of what Bruce represented. He took another step closer, now well within striking distance, though there was no immediate aggression in his posture. It was a calculated move, a way to assert dominance, to apply pressure without throwing a single punch. "You've built a reputation," he continued, his tone firm, unwavering. "But reputation is not proof. Words are not proof." The room felt smaller now, the circle tighter. Every student leaned in just a little more, their focus completely locked on the two men at the center. "Here," the master said, extending his hand slightly as if inviting something more than just conversation. "In this place, we don't rely on stories, we rely on skill." There was a subtle shift in his stance, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but clear to those who understood. He was ready, not fully engaged, not yet attacking, but prepared, balanced, waiting. "This is your chance," he added, his voice steady but laced with challenge. "Show me. Show all of us." The weight of expectation settled heavily over the room. This was no longer just a philosophical disagreement. It had turned into a direct confrontation, a test of ideologies, as much as abilities. Some students felt excitement, their hearts racing at the thought of witnessing something extraordinary. Others felt a hint of nervousness, unsure of how this would unfold. Their master had never been one to issue empty challenges. When he stepped forward like this, it always meant something serious. The karate master held his ground, his gaze unwavering. In his mind, this moment was necessary. It wasn't about ego, at least not entirely. It was about defending the principles he believed in, the system he had dedicated his life to. If someone claimed to surpass or redefine that system, then they had to be tested. To him, this was respect, not hostility. A true martial artist, in his view, should be willing to prove their skill, to stand in front of others and demonstrate the truth behind their methods. And yet, beneath that conviction, there was something else, something quieter, almost hidden, a curiosity, a need to see if the stories were real, if this man who stood so calmly before him truly possessed something beyond what tradition could explain. But that curiosity was buried under layers of pride, discipline, and certainty. Because as far as he was concerned, there was only one correct path to mastery. One system that had stood the test of time. One way that had proven itself over generations. And anything outside of that had yet to earn its place. The challenge had been laid out clearly, and the tension in the room lingered like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Every eye remained fixed on Bruce Lee, waiting for a reaction, a response, anything that would match the intensity of the karate master's words. But what they witnessed instead was something entirely unexpected. There was no immediate shift in posture, no tightening of fists, no visible spark of irritation. Bruce Lee simply stood there, relaxed, yet aware, as if the pressure surrounding him had no weight at all. His stillness wasn't empty, it was controlled. There was a quiet intelligence behind it, a sense that he was processing everything without rushing to respond. Where most would feel the need to defend themselves, to prove something in that very moment, Bruce seemed completely detached from that urgency. It wasn't hesitation. It was choice. His breathing remained steady, almost unnoticeable, as if the entire situation was just another moment in a much larger flow. His shoulders stayed loose, not raised in tension or locked in preparation. Even his stance, while balanced, carried none of the rigid formality that the karate master embodied. It was natural, adaptable, ready without appearing ready. To the students watching, this calmness was confusing. They had expected at least a flicker of emotion, anger, pride, or even nervousness, but there was nothing obvious to read. It was as though Bruce Lee existed outside the emotional current that was pulling everyone else deeper into anticipation. The karate master, however, interpreted this differently. To him, such calmness could only mean one of two things: either supreme confidence or a lack of seriousness, and he wasn't entirely convinced which one he was witnessing. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying every detail, searching for a sign that might reveal the truth beneath the surface. But Bruce Lee gave him nothing. Instead of answering immediately, Bruce allowed a brief silence to stretch between them. It wasn't awkward or uncertain. It felt intentional, as though he understood the power of that pause. In that silence, the energy of the room shifted again, becoming more focused, more intense, like a drawn bow waiting for release. When he finally moved, it was subtle. Just a slight adjustment of his weight, a natural shift that looked effortless, but spoke volumes to anyone trained enough to notice. It wasn't a formal stance, not something pulled from a textbook or a traditional form. It was something fluid, something alive, adapting in real time. His eyes met the karate master's gaze, not with defiance but with clarity. There was no need to dominate or intimidate. He wasn't trying to win a psychological battle. He was simply present, fully aware, fully grounded. Then in a calm, measured voice, he spoke. Not loud, not aggressive, but clear enough to cut through the tension. "You talk about form," he said, his tone steady, almost reflective. "But form is just a beginning." There was no rush in his words. Each sentence seemed to carry weight, not because of how it was delivered, but because of the understanding behind it. "If you cling to form," he continued, "you limit yourself to what has already been defined." A few students shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. This wasn't the kind of response they were used to hearing. It wasn't a direct challenge, nor was it submission. It was something else entirely. A different perspective that didn't fit neatly into their expectations. Bruce Lee's posture remained unchanged, relaxed, yet ready. "Martial arts is not about following a fixed path," he said. "It's about understanding movement, understanding yourself." The karate master listened, his expression tightening slightly. These words challenged more than just technique. They challenged the very philosophy he had built his life around. But Bruce didn't push aggressively. He wasn't trying to tear down the master's beliefs. Instead, he spoke as if offering a broader view, something that existed beyond right or wrong. "You say structure brings control," Bruce went on, his voice calm but firm. "But true control comes when you are not bound by structure." The room grew quieter, if that was even possible. Every word seemed to deepen the contrast between the two men, the rigid certainty of tradition against the fluid adaptability of something new. Bruce Lee took a small step forward, not as an act of aggression, but as a natural continuation of his presence. The movement was smooth, unforced, as though he was simply flowing into a new position rather than stepping into it. "There is a difference," he said, "between practicing a technique and understanding why it works." The karate master's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, listening. Whether out of respect or curiosity, he allowed Bruce to continue. "When you understand," Bruce added, "you are not limited to one way. You can adapt, change, respond to anything." His hands remained relaxed at his sides, not raised in defense, not clenched in preparation. And yet, there was no vulnerability in that openness. It felt intentional, like he had nothing to prove through tension or display. The students watched closely, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. This wasn't how confrontations usually went. There was no shouting, no immediate clash of force. Instead, there was something deeper unfolding, a clash of ideas, of philosophies. Bruce Lee's calmness wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. By refusing to react in the expected way, he disrupted the rhythm of the moment. He shifted the dynamic from a simple challenge into something more complex, something that required thought rather than instinct. "You see," he said, his gaze steady. "Fighting is not about proving who is stronger." There was a brief pause, just enough to let the words settle. It's about understanding what works. In the moment, the simplicity of the statement contrasted sharply with the depth behind it. It wasn't dismissive of tradition, but it didn't rely on it either. It existed in a space where adaptability mattered more than adherence. The karate master shifted slightly, adjusting his stance almost unconsciously. It was a small movement, but it revealed something, an awareness that this situation wasn't unfolding in the way he had anticipated. Bruce Lee noticed but didn't react outwardly. His focus remained steady, his presence unwavering. "You can practice 1,000 forms," he continued. "But if you cannot adapt, those forms will fail you." A subtle ripple of tension moved through the students again. Some looked uncertain, now caught between their loyalty to their master and the undeniable clarity in Bruce's words. "And when that happens," Bruce said quietly, "what will you rely on?" The question wasn't directed aggressively. It wasn't meant to embarrass or provoke. It was genuine, almost philosophical, inviting reflection rather than demanding an answer. His calm demeanor never broke. There was no rise in his voice, no shift toward confrontation. Even as the challenge deepened, he remained grounded, as if he had already accepted whatever outcome might come. In that moment, it became clear that his mindset was fundamentally different. He wasn't here to defend an image or uphold a reputation. He wasn't driven by the need to win or dominate. He was simply expressing what he understood to be true without attachment to how it would be received. And that made him unpredictable. Because without ego, without fear, without the need to prove something, there was nothing to manipulate, nothing to pressure. The karate master stood firm, but the dynamic had shifted. The challenge was no longer one-sided. It had evolved into something more balanced, more uncertain. Bruce Lee's calmness had done what force could not. It had changed the tone of the entire encounter, turning tension into focus and confrontation into something deeper, something that couldn't be resolved with strength alone. And yet, despite all of this, he remained as he had been from the very beginning, relaxed, aware, and completely unshaken. The shift from words to action was almost invisible, like the moment just before lightning strikes. No warning, no build-up that the untrained eye could follow. 1 second, both men stood facing each other, the air thick with anticipation. And the next, something changed so quickly that most of the students didn't even realize it had begun. Bruce Lee didn't announce his movement, didn't signal an attack, didn't transition into a recognizable stance that could be read or predicted. What he did instead was far more unsettling. He moved without permission from expectation. The karate master had prepared himself for a structured exchange. His mind was aligned with years of disciplined training, anticipating a sequence he could recognize, analyze, and counter. His body was ready, grounded in familiar patterns, waiting for an opening that fit within the framework he understood. But what came at him didn't belong to any framework he had mastered. Bruce Lee's first movement was so direct, so efficient, that it bypassed the usual stages of engagement. There was no exaggerated wind-up, no visible tension signaling an incoming strike. It was as if his body responded to the moment itself, not to a planned technique. A sudden shift of weight, a minimal adjustment of distance, and then impact. To the students watching, it was confusing. Some of them blinked and missed it entirely. Others saw only a blur, a flicker of motion that didn't match anything they had practiced. It didn't look like a traditional punch, nor did it follow the expected trajectory of a standard attack. It was something in between, something refined down to its purest function, speed and precision without unnecessary form. The karate master reacted, but his reaction came a fraction too late. His instincts were sharp, his reflexes trained, but they were trained to recognize patterns, to read movements that followed a certain logic. Bruce Lee's strike didn't offer that logic. It appeared and completed itself in a space of time that felt almost unreal. A soft but undeniable contact landed, not with brute force, but with perfect timing. It was controlled, measured, yet unmistakably effective. The kind of strike that didn't need power to prove its point. The master's eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in surprise. His body adjusted instantly, stepping back just enough to regain balance, his mind already recalculating. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't how a proper exchange was supposed to begin. But Bruce Lee didn't pause to let the moment settle. Before the master could fully reset, another movement followed, equally fast, equally precise. This time it came from a slightly different angle, not repeating the same line, not giving the opponent a chance to adapt. It was as if each action was born in the moment, responding not just to the opponent's position, but to the smallest shifts in energy and intent. The students began to murmur, their focus intensifying as they tried to track what was happening. Some leaned forward, their eyes straining to catch the details, but the speed made it nearly impossible. It wasn't just fast. It was efficient in a way that eliminated anything unnecessary. The karate master attempted to counter, his training kicking in. His arms moved into position, his stance adjusted, his body aligning with the techniques he had practiced thousands of times. But every time he prepared to respond, Bruce Lee had already moved past that point. It was like trying to catch something that refused to stay still long enough to be grasped. There was no wasted motion in Bruce's actions. Every step, every shift, every strike served a purpose. He didn't overcommit, didn't linger, didn't give his opponent a stable target. His movement flowed continuously, not in a predictable rhythm but in a way that adapted moment by moment. At one point the master attempted to intercept, launching a controlled counterstrike aimed at disrupting Bruce Lee's flow. It was a clean technique, executed with precision, the kind that would normally force an opponent to retreat or defend. But Bruce didn't meet it head-on. Instead, he slipped just outside its path, not by a large margin, but by the smallest necessary distance. It was almost as if he anticipated the strike before it fully formed. His body rotated slightly, redirecting the energy rather than colliding with it, and in that same motion he delivered another quick response. Again, it wasn't about power. It was about timing. The contact landed before the master could complete his movement, disrupting his balance just enough to prevent a follow-up. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was decisive. Each action seemed to build on the previous one, creating a sequence that felt continuous, unstoppable not because of force but because of its precision. The room had fallen completely silent now. Even the faintest sounds of movement had disappeared. The students were no longer whispering, no longer reacting outwardly. They were locked into the moment, witnessing something they had never seen before. The karate master adjusted again, this time with more urgency. His confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. He was no longer simply testing, he was engaging fully, trying to understand and respond to what was happening. He launched another attempt, this time more aggressive, combining speed with intent to regain control of the exchange. But Bruce Lee's response came even faster. A quick shift, a slight angle change, and suddenly the master's line of attack was no longer aligned. Another strike followed, short, direct, and perfectly timed. The pattern repeated, but it wasn't a pattern in the traditional sense. It was variation within consistency. Bruce Lee wasn't repeating techniques. He was applying principles. Distance, timing, angle. Each element adjusted dynamically, never fixed, never predictable. The master's movements began to show subtle signs of strain, not physical exhaustion but cognitive overload. His mind was working rapidly, trying to process something that didn't fit into his established understanding. Every time he thought he had found an opening, it disappeared. Every time he prepared a response, the situation had already changed. Bruce Lee remained composed throughout. His breathing stayed controlled, his expression calm, as if this level of speed and adaptability required no extra effort. There was no aggression in his face, no visible push to dominate. He was simply moving, responding, existing within the flow of the moment. At one point, the exchange paused for a fraction of a second, not by intention but as a natural break in the movement. The master stood still, his chest rising slightly faster now, his eyes locked onto Bruce Lee with a new level of focus. And in that brief pause, something became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just about speed. It was about understanding. Because what Bruce Lee had demonstrated wasn't a collection of techniques. It was the ability to apply them without being bound by them. To move without hesitation, without the need to recall a specific form or sequence. To respond directly to what was happening, not to what was expected. The students felt it, even if they couldn't fully articulate it. There was a difference between what they had practiced and what they were witnessing. A difference that went beyond skill, beyond strength. The karate master stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in recognition of the gap that had just been revealed. Bruce Lee didn't advance. He didn't press the advantage or attempt to overwhelm. He simply stood there again, as calm as before, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a brief demonstration of something that couldn't be easily explained. For a moment everything stood still, as if time itself had paused to let the weight of what just happened settle into the room. The air no longer carried the sharp tension of challenge. It carried something heavier, something quieter. The students, who had once leaned forward in excitement, now stood frozen, their eyes shifting between their master and Bruce Lee, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The karate master remained in place, but there was a noticeable difference in his presence. His stance, once rigid and commanding, had softened, not in weakness, but in awareness. His breathing was slightly deeper now, not out of exhaustion, but as if his body was adjusting to a realization his mind was still catching up to. He replayed the exchange in his head, piece by piece, trying to understand where things had shifted, beyond his control. He had faced skilled opponents before. He had trained for years, refined his techniques, sharpened his reactions. And yet, what he had just experienced didn't feel like a traditional contest of skill. It felt like he had stepped into something unfamiliar, something that didn't follow the rules he had spent his life mastering. His eyes remained fixed on Bruce Lee, but the intensity behind them had changed. The earlier skepticism, the quiet, arrogance, the need to test and challenge, all of it had faded into something more introspective. There was no longer a question of whether Bruce Lee was fast or different. That had already been answered. What remained was a deeper question, one that had nothing to do with speed or strength. The students sensed it too. They looked at their master, expecting him to respond in the way he always did. With authority, with certainty, with a clear statement that would restore balance to their understanding. But no such response came immediately. Instead, there was silence. A long, unbroken silence that carried more meaning than any words could have. The karate master slowly straightened, not to reassert dominance, but to regain composure. His posture was still disciplined, still grounded, but no longer rigid in the same way. There was a subtle openness now, as if something within him had shifted, creating space for a perspective he hadn't considered before. He took a step forward, but this time the movement lacked the earlier edge of challenge. It wasn't confrontational. It was measured, thoughtful. "You," he began, his voice quieter than before, though still steady. He paused briefly, as if choosing his words more carefully than he had at the start. "That was not karate." The statement hung in the air, but it didn't carry the same dismissive tone it might have earlier. It sounded more like an observation than a judgment. Bruce Lee didn't react immediately. He remained as he had been, calm, composed, fully present. His expression showed no sign of offense, no need to defend or explain. The master continued, his gaze unwavering but no longer sharp with doubt. And yet, he added, his voice trailing slightly before finding its strength again, it was effective. That admission alone caused a ripple through the students. They had never heard their master speak in such a way, not after a challenge, not after an exchange like this. It wasn't defeat, but it wasn't victory either. It was something in between, something unfamiliar. The karate master took another breath, slower this time, as if grounding himself in the reality of what he had just experienced. I have spent my life studying form, he said, his tone reflective now. Perfecting technique, following the path that was taught to me. There was no regret in his voice, only clarity. And I believed, he continued, that within that path, there was nothing more to learn. The students shifted slightly, their attention deepening. This was no longer about a challenge. It had become something else entirely, a moment of realization unfolding in real time. The master's eyes softened, just enough to reveal the shift within him. But what I saw, he said slowly, was not bound by that path. He looked around briefly, not at the room itself, but at the space where the exchange had taken place, as if trying to reconcile what he knew with what he had just witnessed. It moved differently, he added. Not random, not without control, but not restricted. The words came carefully, each one chosen with intention, as if he was building a new understanding step by step. Bruce Lee listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. The master turned his attention back to him. You did not follow a form, he said, and yet, there was structure in what you did. It was a realization that seemed to surprise even him as he spoke it. A different kind of structure, he clarified, almost to himself. The students exchanged glances again, their confusion growing, but so did their curiosity. They had always been taught that structure came from repetition, from discipline, from mastering predefined techniques. But what they had just seen challenged that idea in a way they couldn't ignore. The karate master took a small step back, not out of retreat, but as if giving space, not just physically, but mentally. I see now, he said, his voice quieter, more grounded, that what I called chaos was not chaos at all. He paused, again letting the weight of that admission settle. It was freedom. The word lingered in the air, unfamiliar yet undeniable. For years, he continued, I believed that discipline meant control through limitation, that by narrowing the path, one could reach mastery. His gaze lowered briefly, not in shame, but in reflection. But perhaps, he said slowly, true mastery is not about narrowing the path. He looked up again, meeting Bruce Lee's eyes with a new level of respect. Perhaps it is about understanding when to leave it. The students felt the shift completely now. This wasn't just a lesson in technique. It was a transformation in perspective. The master's shoulders relaxed slightly, the rigid edge of authority replaced by something more balanced. You have shown me something I did not expect, he admitted. There was no resistance in his voice, no attempt to protect his earlier stance, just honesty. I challenged you, he said, because I believed I understood what martial arts should be. A faint pause. But what I understand now is that I only understood part of it. The room remained silent, not out of tension, but out of respect for the moment. The karate master inclined his head slightly, not a full bow, but enough to signal acknowledgement. Your way, he said, choosing his words carefully, is different. Another brief pause. But it is not wrong. For the students, that moment carried more impact than any strike they had witnessed. Their master, who had always stood as a symbol of certainty, was now showing something far more powerful, the ability to recognize and accept a new truth. Bruce Lee gave a slight nod in return, not as a gesture of victory, but as a simple acknowledgement. There was no triumph in his expression, no sense of having proven something, only calm understanding. The distance between them remained, but the dynamic had completely changed. What began as a challenge had become a moment of realization, one that reached beyond the two men at the center and into the minds of everyone watching. And in that quiet space where words had softened and perspectives had shifted, the true impact of what had just happened continued to unfold, deeper than any technique, stronger than any display of force, and impossible to ignore.